Welcome to the Nantucket Gam. I'm Annalie Gilbert-Keith, and I'm joined today by Thomas Parrish.
Hello.
And Adam DeLogue.
How's it going?
We are members of the Visitor Operations team at the Nantucket Historical Association. In each episode, one of us will go on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then we'll invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. In this episode, we will dive into Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard's threats to secede from Massachusetts in 1977. Later, we will be joined by State Senator Dylan Fernandes, who got his start in politics as Nantucket's former representative in the State House of Representatives.
It's 9:29 p.m. on a spring evening in May 1977. We are in Boston, where State Representative Terrence McCarthy, or Terry, as his friends call him back home in Martha's Vineyard, rises to speak. He pleads with the State House of Representatives to vote down the upcoming bill. This is a redistricting bill that would end nearly 300 years of political precedent by eliminating the individual representatives from the islands. The islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket are so adamantly against it, they've been threatening to secede from Massachusetts if it passes. As McCarthy speaks, some colleagues in the House nod along sympathetically, but most are unmoved by his pleas. Soon after, McCarthy takes his seat. The bill goes to vote. 11:05 p.m. The lights of the electronic voting system turn on with the results. 115 green, a mere 75 red. The vote passes. As the lights turn off, Terry and his colleague from Nantucket, Representative John Conway, let it painfully sink in, and for the first time in nearly 3 centuries, their seats in state government have just been eliminated. And now, the islands have a choice to make. Would they make good on their threat to secede from Massachusetts?
Let's back up a little bit and talk about how we got to this moment when this bill passes. I first learned about secession as a concept in the context of the American Civil War, so it surprised me that such a small place was making such a dramatic statement. Secession seems like a really big deal, and it just felt really counterintuitive.
Well, the Civil War is definitely the historic touchstone for many Americans, but it's far from the only instance of secession. In fact, secession is a relatively common conversation in American politics. Secession is broadly just a withdrawal from a governing body. In a democratic system, it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. When that contract is breached, you can withdraw.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of ongoing movements, probably not popular movements, but movements to secede around the United States. Texas, California, was it Eastern Oregon wants to join Idaho?
I found this quote when I was reading a little bit about secession, that some people believe that secession is as American as apple pie.
I think you could argue that the United States was founded by secession with our independence movement. Across all these secession movements, the underwriting theme is that those who are seceding feel fundamentally different than those they are seceding from. And so you have these questions of identity in terms of who we are versus who they are, us versus them. And it almost always comes down to this political question and this feeling of being underrepresented in comparison to other parts of the political body.
I grew up in Western Mass, and there were always people talking about the western part of Massachusetts seceding from the state, but it never really seemed to go past these little comments around town. And so what fascinated me about Nantucket is that this movement did get a little bit further.
Nantucket's actually had 3 separate secession attempts. The one we're talking about today in 1977 is the one that got the furthest. It went from just this conversation to actually being a political movement. It made its way all the way up to the desk of the governor, in fact. That's
kind of wild. What sparked this movement in 1977?
Well, we have to back up a little bit. In the 1970s, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided to shrink the House of Representatives. This took a constitutional amendment. It became known as the House Cut Act. And it cut the House of Representatives from a 240-person body down to 160.
Was it just, getting a little too cramped in the State House, or?
Its goal was to make the body more streamlined and economically efficient, but this required a redistricting of the entire Commonwealth. And part of this redistricting included the bill we opened the episode with, that combined Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket into a single district with parts of Cape Cod. This eliminated the individual representative from both of those islands. And this, beyond anything else, is really what triggered the secession movement in 1977.
Are there further implications to losing those individual representatives past their direct connection to the state government? What was actually being threatened by this bill?
So redistricting happens frequently, in fact, every time there's a census. But this was different on the islands because it wasn't just fiddling with borders, it was fundamentally altering the representation. Because both islands were going from having their own representative to being combined as a one-third minority for one. They threatened the island in three ways. First, there was this perspective of a unique identity amongst the islanders, that people on Nantucket and the Vineyard are different than those in the Cape. Secondly, there's also this idea that islands have unique needs, both political and economic, and so having a direct representative who can advocate for those needs in the state legislature is seen as a huge political advantage. And third, this is a deeply rooted historical precedent. Since the 1690s, both Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket have had a representative in Boston. That's actually 80 years older than the United States is. So this is not something that could just be taken lightly.
But then on the other hand, why was the state so supportive of this change?
Well, on the other hand, from the state's perspective, from the mainland perspective, it actually makes complete sense. When you're drawing districts, they need to be roughly equal size. Before the House Cut Amendment, this meant that every district in Massachusetts was approximately 23,000 people. Well, after the House was cut by 1/3, this district size jumped to 36,000, meaning that Nantucket, with their own representative, would be 6 times smaller, and the Vineyard would be 4 times smaller than every other district on the mainland, which in practice meant that every vote for representative on Nantucket was 6 times more powerful per vote than any vote on the mainland. This creates a fundamental imbalance in political power. And if you believe the one person, one vote doctrine, which is a tenet of American democracy, this is fundamentally unequal. This is fundamentally unfair to voters on the mainland. It gives the islands an unfair political say.
How had they let that go on for so long?
Well, this wasn't a secret. This was an acknowledged part of their representation. In fact, in 1968, so about a decade before the secession movement kicks off, the state was actually sued over this question of overrepresentation of the islands. This was a court case. In one of the only instances I know of, the state actually advocated in favor of unequal representation. They argued, quote, "The departments of the Commonwealth manifestly believe that genuine representation of the islands would not survive should they be merged into a mainland district or districts." They are arguing there are unique needs of the islands, and that as their own counties, both Martha's Vineyard as Dukes County and Nantucket as Nantucket County, merit their own individual representatives.
Some people might argue that states argue for unequal representation all the time. I mean, the Senate exists.
That's a good point. But I guess in terms of this, the idea being that in the House of Representatives, the larger population you have, the more representation you have. And the islands have a smaller population, but equal representation, which kind of fundamentally goes against the idea of the House of Representatives.
Yeah, the House of Representatives is where you try to have that equality.
Yes. So when you're redistricting, you do it in state. You're trying to create each district within your state as equal as possible. And every district on the mainland was only within a 10% variance of this 23,000 person number. The islands were about 70 and 80% off, respectively.
So they were pretty overrepresented.
They were. Objectively, they were.
On one side of the argument, you have this feeling that the islands are being overrepresented. And then on the other side, the islands are feeling like they're underrepresented. So did that contribute to the conversation at all in the government?
That's a great point, because you have the rational, mathematic overrepresentation, and then you have the emotional, personal feeling of feeling underrepresented, because they see themselves as a unique community that does not share the same needs and political desires as constituents on the mainland.
So the islands have threatened to secede. How do they initiate that?
They start throwing clam chowder into the harbor.
That would be great. A few months after the redistricting bill goes to vote, Martha's Vineyard takes the first stand. The Vineyard Gazette, the newspaper on Martha's Vineyard, it writes, quote, "With grim determination but heavy heart, the All Island Select Men's Association members voted Wednesday to withdraw the islands from Martha's Vineyard from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and form the nation's 51st state, if the General Court persists in its current plan to strip the island of representation." And then they write that they sent an invitation to Nantucket to join this new 51st state.
When that was published, had the redistricting bill already passed? No,
this was a few months before the vote. The islands were using secession as political leverage.
What comes after that? They've announced this movement, and then they've invited Nantucket. What now?
So Terrence McCarthy, Terry, who we met at the beginning of this episode, he really takes a vocal lead. Martha's Vineyard really sets the stage. They're the ones who seem to be pushing for it earlier, but Nantucket follows suit. A month later, on March 22nd, 1977, Terrence McCarthy stands on the steps of the State House in Boston, and he reads a proclamation of independence that was approved by both islands. It's based off the Declaration of Independence, and it concludes with, quote, "It is our hope that the Commonwealth will recognize the validity of our appeals and restore our right. But if the Commonwealth persists in its plan to thrust arbitrary government upon us, we shall be confronted with an intolerable situation. We are prepared to withdraw our consent to its continued authority over us and dissolve all connections with it. Anything less would be a betrayal of the sacrifices of our ancestors and a renunciation of the rights of future generations." And with that, the threat of secession had officially been levied.
This feels very official, having it in writing and formal language. Do we have any idea what people were thinking outside of that realm? What were normal people on the islands feeling about this?
On April 4th, just a couple of days after the Proclamation of Independence was read, the island held a non-binding referendum to gauge support. 75% of voters voted in favor of secession if redistricting passes.
75% is a pretty striking amount of people to agree. I mean, if you or, if anybody else has been to town meeting recently, you'll know that getting 75% of anybody to agree on anything is a feat here on Nantucket.
Right, so there's a couple of things to qualify there. One, it's non-binding, so you're always going to vote a bit more radical. And two, the wording of the referendum was quite leading. So it wasn't a completely neutral vote, but 75% of voters is not an insignificant amount. And so after this referendum, the town actually created a committee, the Committee of Representation or Secession.
So they're all in on this, or at least 75% of them are. What's the next step?
Well, they have to figure out what secession actually means. As we said earlier in the episode, secession by itself just means the withdrawal from a governing body, right? In some ways, that's kind of the easy part. The difficult part is what comes next. Where do you go? So at the beginning, the Vineyard suggested becoming a 51st state. Well, there's some incredibly difficult legal and political loopholes and pitfalls of that. And so that seems to be dropped almost immediately, as it said. But the Secession Committee, as that committee on Nantucket became known colloquially, they wanted to go a different route. Instead of forming a 51st state, they instead wanted to leave Massachusetts and form an alliance with another state. And as soon as that was said, offers from other states started coming in. On March 23rd, New Hampshire actually reached out, and in the State House of Representatives, they presented a formal motion that read, "The state of New Hampshire offers to the people of the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard full rights of citizenship in the state of New Hampshire." And the following day, on March 24th, 1977, Vermont would follow suit with the Vermont House of Representatives offers a refuge for these salty cast-offs. I love that image.
Well, they were just trying to get a beach.
They were trying to get a beach. But it wasn't them alone. All of New England, so Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Maine, all submit offers to house these salty cast-offs, as Vermont called them. New York also offered a place for them. And some oral histories in our collection suggest that Arizona and even Nevada actually reached out, but those don't seem to have been followed up very far.
That just blows my mind that so many states responded to this. I never think of the islands as being part of this national awareness like that.
There were articles published about the secession movement of the islands in newspapers across the country. And all this publicity definitely elevated the profile of these islands that was still building the tourist economies.
Did the islands take any of these offers seriously? Did they follow up with any of these states that offered to house the islands?
They did. New Hampshire was the leading candidate, in a large part because it's a small state, guaranteeing greater proportional representation, and the most American reason of all, low taxes.
Well, of course.
And Governor Mildred Thompson Jr., who is in many ways responsible for the New Hampshire pessimism about any broad taxes, was the governor of New Hampshire at the time, and he actually came to visit Nantucket with the specified purpose of trying to convince the islands to join New Hampshire. And one of the incentives he offered was to cut all taxes on alcohol.
We would have had our very own big red liquor barn.
Not sure how the Historic Commission would feel about that, but...
Maybe if we put cedar shakes on it.
Oh, there you go.
Outside of these newspapers and governments, were there any other responses that were notable?
Well, it actually made its way all the way up to the White House. Jimmy Carter was president. And part of the story, though, is the islands were starting to have a little bit of fun with the movement. In fact, they made these playful passports for the, quote, orphan islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and you could get them stamped on the island. One of those was actually sent to President Carter, and so he was personally aware of the secession movement.
Were there other little merch pieces or visual representations of this movement?
It was called a bumper sticker affair in one way, because it was just bumper stickers galore. And you had things like, in our need, we must secede, SEA, seed. And so there were bumper stickers, there were pins. Some of these are in our collection. We still have them.
Well, there's, still people who are flying the flag of secession.
That's another good point. It was a blue flag with an orange sun and a white bird flying across it. You still see it on Nantucket. Young's Bike Shop actually flies it every now and then. But it wasn't even just merch. They even had an anthem that was written by a Vineyarder.
'Twas the big freeze of 77. A group got together, numbering about 11. The farmers, the fishermen, selectmen too. Islanders all to decide what to do. A rallying cry was heard the islands.
Okay. There's all this momentum, and everybody seems fairly supportive at this point. What does the secession committee do next to try to make this a feasible option?
Well, some of it I think is fun. I think there is some tongue-in-cheekness to it, but to the secession committee, it still was a serious endeavor. And so they reach out to New York-based lawyer and Nantucket summer resident Arthur Dean to investigate what realignment with New Hampshire would actually look like if the redistricting bill passes, and they do have to follow through on the threats to secede.
And what's happening with the redistricting bill while they're investigating that?
It's in committee. It's going through debate. The representatives from the islands, John Conway from Nantucket and Terrence McCarthy from Martha's Vineyard, they are negotiating in Boston. They are attempting to get one representative for the two islands, so the two islands would become their own voting district with their own representative. They try to kill the bill on the floor, the rallying support to vote against it. But ultimately, come May 16th, none of that comes to fruition. As we saw at the beginning of this episode, ultimately, the bill passes. And with that, the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard lose their independent representatives to the House in Boston.
And now we find out, did they succeed in seceding? I kind of hated that.
I kind of liked it, actually. A little mood swing, but... Well, now is the question, right? At this point, for about 4 or 5 months, the islands have been threatening to secede if this bill passes. They have New Hampshire lined up to be an option to join. But after the bill passes, people wait and wait and wait. But ultimately, news of the island seceding never comes. 2 weeks after the bill passes, that lawyer, Arthur Dean, who was the Summer Sconset resident, he returns to the Secession Committee a list of 32, to be frank, quite legitimate questions about what realigning with New Hampshire actually looks like. Included in it is what happens to license and insurance. Would they have to transition all of those? Would the state just take over those? Or would that have to be done by individuals? What about wills and deeds registered in Massachusetts? Would they have to go and take all of them out and re-register them in New Hampshire? That's a lot of clerical work.
It's such a pain doing all that stuff just within your state. I can't imagine having to deal with all of that.
Also, what about schools? How do the school systems compare? Enough to commit the islands to New Hampshire public schools? Would Massachusetts have to consent to the islands leaving? Would they consent? What about trade and transportation? You have taxes, and now all trade from the Cape to the islands is across state lines. That introduces a whole slew of tax laws and tax implications. All of this was unanswered. And without having concrete answers, they can't move forward with secession.
It's sort of hard to think about, what's going to happen to you. All these questions, you don't even know where to start, right? Because nothing like this has been done.
There was a question to Jimmy Carter's press secretary about would they invade the islands if they became independent nations, if they attacked the U.S. like these are abstract questions, but they actually do have deep political meaning to them.
I would have to imagine that even if you were real pro-secession to begin with, once you start discussing the possibility that you might be invaded by Massachusetts state troopers, I think that would probably, rightfully so, turn some people off of the idea.
Did they just give up? What do you do at that point?
They kept trying for a bit. The Secession Committee even came up with this idea that Nantucket could be a territory of Massachusetts, sort of like how Puerto Rico is to the United States. But the Vineyard thought that went too far politically, and eventually they backed out. Eventually they did give up. Almost exactly a year after the secession movement was started by Martha's Vineyard, members of the Nantucket Committee of Representation, or Secession, headed up to Boston. They meet with the Massachusetts Legislative Research Bureau, and they discuss this idea of creating a territorial commission. But ultimately, John Welch, a member of this committee, would sum up the meeting by saying, quote, "It seems to me that this committee has gone about as far as it can go." Right? And it had at this point. So soon after, the secession committee was dissolved, and Nantucket resigned to remain a part of Massachusetts.
And we've been complaining about it ever since.
Just to be clear, before we wrap up this episode, the islands still have representation.
Yes. The rhetoric of the time was that they are losing representation, right? And I think that kind of percolated into my vernacular. We did not lose representation. We lost an individual representative, right? And that is a difference. We do have representatives, and now our current representative district includes Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Falmouth, and the Elizabeth Islands.
Does that mean that often the representative is from the islands?
No, mostly they're from Falmouth.
Surprisingly, despite being the minority, I think there's only been one representative from either island.
Timothy Madden.
Yeah, Tim Madden, that's right, Tim Madden. Everyone else has been from Falmouth or from other parts of the Cape. And Martha's Vineyard has never had a representative elected.
So in some ways, they were right. Now we are represented by people from Falmouth.
I think that when we look at the secession movement, it's easy to see this kind of crazy story. But what it really comes down to is this desire to be seen as a community, right? That there are needs on Nantucket that can be seen as unique. But
it's also about the crazy fun story.
I mean, it can be. But when we think about the
mostly.
When we think about the modern significance of why we tell this history, is that to me, it really demonstrates this deep set image of Nantucketers as a unique community. And that identity that's formed by life on an island with its, we all are bonded by this idea of having to take a boat when we leave island. Most of us know the boat schedule to some extent. And that allows us to commiserate with communities like Martha's Vineyard. But the reason that secession really kicks off is that the identity that's formed by this is seen as not only different, but in some ways politically oppositional to those communities on the Cape that we were being redistricted into. And so it is a fun story, and there's a lot of pieces to take away from it. But I think that what the takeaway of this story is is that there was a political and unique identity of Nantucketers, and I don't think that's really gone away. We are part of a different district now, and we are still combined with parts of the Cape, but I don't think the identity of Nantucketers has receded that much.
I don't think you can ever take that away.
I think not.
A rallying cry was heard the island through. 'Tis time to secede from you know.
All right, thanks for listening to the Nantucket Gam. Right after this break, we'll be back with an interview with State Senator Dylan Fernandes.
We love our land from shore to shore. Secession's the answer, we could take no more. Onward, steadfast for the right. Keep your vigil through the night. From East Job Light to Menem Shabite. Keep our little island tight.
We are joined now by Dylan Fernandes, who as of January of 2025 is the state senator for Plymouth and Barnstable, but who started his elected political career by serving in the state house as the representative for Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and Falmouth. Thanks for being here with us.
My pleasure.
I want to talk with you in the context of the secession movement here on Nantucket. But are you aware of the secession movement in '77, or had you heard about it a little bit?
I actually have in my office the Martha's Vineyard secessionist flag.
Oh, do you really?
Oh yeah,
The one
It
with
was
the
a beautiful
bird and the
flag,
sun?
Actually, it's like a light blue with an orange sun and a sea turn in the middle. It's really pretty flag. A lot of it I think was fun. Some of it was serious. But what ended up happening is that as a concession, this seat that I used to represent, the Barnstable Dukes and Nantucket seat, there was some legislation passed in a budget, which doesn't make it permanent, by the way, but there was legislation passed in a budget saying that, there will be an island liaisons for the district. So unlike every other House district in the state, where if you come in as a freshman legislator, you only get one legislative aide, this is a district that you automatically get 3 legislative aides because there are 2 kind of part-time island liaison positions, one for the Vineyard, one for Nantucket. And that's really important because, this is the most beautiful district in, I think, on the planet. But it is not easy to get around. And because you have Cuttyhunk in here too, which people forget about. So if you want to travel to every town, there's 9 towns in the district. If you want to travel to everyone, it would take you like 2.5 days to do it. And there's so many meetings. So it's really important that you have those island liaisons to be able to go represent you, represent the town, represent the state in some of these kind of important meetings. And so that was what came out of it, and that's the current iteration that exists today.
Well, you've done your homework then. You know a little bit about it. Not everyone does. When I was talking about this episode, I was bringing up secession movement. Even people here on Nantucket didn't really know that much about it.
Oh, I know a lot. I mean, that's my... I served in the district, right? Like for 8 years. And so I know I did a lot of research on the history. And then it's important to know that history in the context of trying to ensure that the islands still have island liaisons, because oftentimes, people in Boston, they have no clue, right, how hard it is to get around this district. The farthest person in the House side, probably, they probably represent maybe North Adams, somewhere kind of way out there in a corner of Western Mass. But for them, it takes them 2.5 hours, at most to travel around their district, which is a lot. I don't, I sympathize with that, but it's not even close to how the travel needed for this really unique district in the state and I think in the country as well. And then also you got to factor in, there are multiple times where I was stuck on Nantucket.
Oh yeah.
For a few days at a time. Because, whatever storm was rolling in, but no one feels bad for you. I would always complain. I was like, I can't get off the island. And everyone was like, oh, poor you, you're stuck on Nantucket. But it's sometimes you gotta you got things to do, so you need to get off.
I want to back up a little bit because in 2016, you ran to be the state representative for Nantucket, Dukes County, so Martha's Vineyard, and Falmouth, and that was your first position as an elected official, correct?
Yeah.
You just described that it is a pretty unique geographic district. So what inspired you to want to become a state representative for it?
Public service is something I always wanted to do and wanted as a career path, because I thought, look, we only have a limited time on this planet. You might as well do it trying to help people and trying to make the world a better place. And there's a lot of ways to do that. You can do that in the private sector. You can do that in the nonprofit sector. I think probably the most impactful is government and public service. And so that's where I wanted to go into. And, my family, I'm a fourth generation resident of our district. And, my father's family grew up in really kind of extreme poverty here. My dad kind of worked his way out of it and then helps pay for my college, which is, I'm a first generation college student. And so, giving back to the community and district and country that's given me so much is something I felt passionate about. And so I got involved in politics and public service. I was actually in the Attorney General's office at the time when the seat opened up. Tim Madden was stepping down, my predecessor.
From Nantucket, correct?
So I quit. Yeah, I quit that job because you can't raise money as a state employee, and and raising money is a sad necessity of political campaigning. So I quit that job, and then it was basically a 6-month campaign where I was living on a really small budget and bouncing between islands.
How important is it in your campaign, and as you think about representing such a geographically diverse area, that the constituency feels connected to the state representative, whether that's you or your predecessor or successor?
Well, I think it's really important. The islands in particular, and really the whole region, there's not many of us. And the islands only have one rep, one senator, and the Cape as a whole, it's only 6 reps and 2 senators. And so as a region, it's really important that we are working together and speaking to the unique issues that are facing us, because, Boston's got like 50 or 60 reps and senators. So I think it's really important to work together with people and kind of build coalitions to be more of a unified voice in this region, so that you can elevate the issues that are important to Nantucket. And that's what I found was really helpful, working with, it was at the time Sarah Peak, who represented Provincetown. I mean, they had some very similar issues in terms of housing and tourism and water quality that Nantucket had. And so, working together with her and other members of the Cape delegation to elevate issues that are unique to our region and try to be more of a unified voice in face of other regions that had a ton more representatives, but actually weren't as unified and kind of backing the issues that are important to Nantucket, but actually are, at the end of the day, regional issues. And Nantucket, is kind of the bellwether for the district or for the region. The issues impacting Nantucket are going to impact the Vineyard, are going to impact the Cape. But usually they're more pronounced on the island because, it's 30 miles out to sea. It's more expensive. But you can just take a look at Nantucket to see where the rest of the region is heading, especially in terms of house pricing. So, it's important for us to be able to come together and work as a region to kind of elevate these issues that are impacting islanders.
Well, you mentioned that's important to build coalition, but I want to read you a quote from a letter that was written to the Committee of Representational Secession. And it reads, quote, "We recognize, and there can be no doubt of, the fact that A, we island residents do have unique problems not generally encountered by mainland residents. B, we are subject to laws of the Commonwealth which in many instances are not suitable to our insular situation. C, the Commonwealth is not in a position to furnish us with many services equal in quality to those furnished to mainland residents." I think if you ask many Nantucketers today, we can think of examples that kind of fall into these categories, whether it's unique problems like transportation. We can't bring workers on the commuter rail in to Nantucket. whether it's subject to laws. You can cite the inspection station. We only have one inspection station for the entire island, so all commercial and personal vehicles have to go through one inspection station. Or like varsity sports for high school athletes wanting to travel and be more competitive. It's pretty tough from Nantucket. Now, I'm wondering if you think that this is a valid assertion that Nantucket has unique problems, or if this is more of an island mentality.
I think both things are true. I think Nantucket has some unique issues, but is not nearly as unique as it thinks it is. So like the fundamentals impacting Nantucket are actually not unique when it comes to housing affordability, when it comes to water quality issues, when it comes to the impacts of sea level rise, increased storms, and the like, and then also when it comes to like some of the fundamentals of the economy around tourism. These are issues that have different gradients of severity, but they're not unique to Nantucket. I'm sorry, guys. Around the edges, there are definitely things that Nantucket is unique about. And I viewed a part of my job was trying to like get the state out of the way so that Nantucket can deal with some of its own problems, and looking to carve out kind of specific exemptions for Nantucket. I mean, one of the first things I passed into law, which is an interesting one, was around marijuana, because there was a ballot initiative. The ballot initiative didn't take into account the Vineyard or Nantucket. So pot was legal in the state, but in order to get it to the Vineyard, you either had to go take the ferry, which is regulated by the United States Coast Guard, or fly, which is, regulated by the FAA, both federal agencies. And obviously it's illegal at the federal level. So how can the islands, get their pot? And by the way, the islands voted as a region, like higher than almost anywhere else in the state for legalization, the Vineyard and Nantucket. And so I through the House, Julian in the Senate, passed legislation that had a special carve out for the islands to say that the islands can test their own products and don't have to ship it to other testing facilities across the state. And so I think that was the first carve out I ever got that was kind of island specific, about halfway into my first term representing Nantucket.
I mean, whether it's true or not, the rhetoric, especially in the secession movement, the rhetoric that the island, especially Nantucket, has unique problems, really set the stage for the idea that there was a unique way of life on Nantucket that allowed those, especially those most vocal advocates for the secession movement, to commiserate with those on Martha's Vineyard. But I think one of the biggest takeaways from researching the secession movement is that it really speaks to this identity around which Nantucketers could coalesce. And that, we can argue and I agree with what you're saying about the uniqueness of the situation on Nantucket, but it really prompted this conversation about what makes Nantucket Nantucket. And I think that the most interesting part about the secession movement is the fact that Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard had this group that was so actively against joining parts of the Cape politically. And so you see an identity formed in the islands that didn't lend itself to easily merge with the identity of Cape Cod. And I was wondering if this is something that you still see as a former representative of this district, if you see this breakdown of identities that is a little bit more siloed than perhaps other parts that you now represent on the mainland.
Yeah, for sure. And this isn't tribalism or whatever word you want to choose. I mean, it's not, it's just like, this is just human nature. We see it all the time. It can work against your best interest in a lot of ways. One example of this is in the Cape and Islands delegation, we created the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund, which is on track to raise $1 billion over the next 25 years. It's around 5 years old, for water quality in our region. And this is one of our biggest needs in terms of, pipes and pumps, sewer infrastructure, alternative septic systems. You can even use it for shellfish propagation, things like that, to help improve water quality, which is arguably our biggest and most valuable natural asset. And not just looking at it from an economic perspective. I mean, it's just why I personally love living in our region, is appreciating the ocean and our water. And so, we have this huge fund. It's raising a ton of money. Towns across the Cape are taking advantage of it and using it to fund projects. And the Vineyard in Nantucket still haven't joined it. And local residents don't pay for the fund. It's paid for by tourists. And so you have a scenario where Nantucket is foregoing tens of millions of dollars of other people's money and putting it on the backs of their own residents in terms of paying for water and sewer infrastructure projects. I know there's big ones that are hugely costly, like going out to Nantucket and things like that. And they're opting to, have their residents pay for it rather than join a fund that would help them pay for it because it's regional. But when we were creating the fund, you'd have the same thing on the Cape. You'd have people from, Falmouth being like, well, I don't know about, joining this fund with people from Provincetown, right? Like that's far away. We don't really know those people. So it's not unique to the island at all. It's, it's probably just slightly more pronounced there.
Well, I have a hunch I know how you're going to answer this because you are not from the islands, but you represented the islands. But I want to read you another quote from the Proclamation of Independence. So when the islands decided they were going to pursue secession, they published this document based off the Declaration of Independence. And there's an interesting line here that I want to read. Therein lies the essential justification for our protest. That is, the only effective advocate for the island is an islander. There is no other way the government can reasonably comprehend our needs, and without the capacity, the underlying purpose of the government itself is negated. Now, you represented Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, but obviously you are not an islander. Do you agree with this?
No, I don't. I don't agree. I mean, look, I think you can be, I like to think I was pretty effective for the islands. And I don't think you need to live there to do it. I mean, the thing about this district, right, is that because it's so separated, like the place I spent by far the least amount of time was Falmouth because I didn't need to. Like I already knew everyone. I kind of knew the issues there. And so when representing the islands, I spent most of my time on the Vineyard in Nantucket. And, a lot of my thinking was like, how can I help the islands? Oftentimes to the, not necessarily the detriment, but to the, well, maybe you could say that like of Falmouth, because I like politically, right? Falmouth was already like I had Falmouth down. I was known there, grew up there, lifelong resident. So as an outsider, if you will, if you want to be good at your job, like you better be spending time in the places and reaching out to the places that don't know you as well. So there's that piece. And then, man, I passed 30 plus bills into law. I think 25 of them were for the islands. Basically, Nantucket files more home rule petitions than any place in the state by far.
Can you just explain what that means real quick?
The home rule petition is state legislation, state bill, but it only impacts one city or town. And so Nantucket, I'd sometimes have like 10 or 11 bills in one session that are just Nantucket, which is more than the city of Boston by far. So I think I passed at least 15, probably 20 bills just for Nantucket, and just for carve-outs that were Nantucket specific. And that is more bills passed in my 8 years than anyone else in the entire legislature passed for a single municipality.
I say this in a little bit of jest, but in some ways, your tenure as a state representative is what many of the secessionists feared. A representative who is elected through the democratic process from the mainland, who is then representing the islands. We're 50 years removed from the secession movement. Do you feel that some of these fears and the motivating forces that prompted the secession movement, whether it was serious or more tongue-in-cheek, were justified, or do you think a lot of those have proven to be created a tenable solution now?
Well, I just don't think it matters because, unfortunately, we have a constitution to uphold unfortunately for Nantucket. It's just, we can either live in a democratic society where there's one person, one vote, or or an undemocratic one. And I think Nantucketers would and Vineyarders would choose to live in a democratic society. And look, that I got elected by Islanders at the end of the day. I mean, they elected me. The House district, the vast majority of its electorate is Islanders. So there's no way I could have won without their support.
Thank you for joining us here on the Nantucket Gam, and wish you all the best as a new state senator. So thank you.
Appreciate it. My pleasure. It was fun. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Nantucket Gam. We'll be back next month with a new episode. For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. The Martha's Vineyard National Anthem was sung by Andre Sang Quackenbush and accompanied by Isaiah Williams, based on sheet music by Barbara St. Pierre Hotchkiss of Vineyard Haven. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association.
Twas the big freeze of 77. A group got together, numbering about 11. The farmers, the fishermen, selectmen too. Islanders all to decide what to do. A rallying cry was heard the island through. 'Tis time to secede from you know who. Onward steadfast for the right. Keep your vigil through the night. From East Light to Menenshamite. Keep our little island tight. Patrick, Henry, and Thomas Paine would leap with joy at our refrain. Will Choppy be happy as a territory, or want equal status in our victory?